Fantastic. So, guys, POIs in the tech space, I'll take as many as possible. Especially up. If you have like a comparative you don't think I'm engaging, just let me know. I'll take you as soon as possible. So I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, today's debate is a simple question: whether we are going to let one child die or we're going to let thousands of children die. The second thing we're going to prove today is that we think, in terms of reparation, we think this is quite important. Why is it reparation? This is our model because it's a policy debate. What we're going to do is we're going to take a direct victim of Osama who lost his child, and then we're going to travel back in time and have that victim then take baby Osama's life. That's what we're going to do. Why do we think that this is ultimately important? Because we think it's a factor of reparation. Because we think that in this particular debate, if we know that a certain harm is certain to happen and the harm has already occurred, then we think it's justified for an individual who has been harmed to be able to get like their due justice. And that's what we are for from opening government, right? First thing then first, why do we think that necessarily, if we do kill Osama, that this is something that is going to change the active existence of our society today? So first, because generally we all know that Osama was a general figurehead, which meant two things. First, he inspired a whole new sector of fighters within Al-Qaeda. But secondly, he orchestrated different forms of attacks, which led to a lot of multiple deaths. A lot of individuals were generally harmed. Most of them lost their lives. And these are the kinds of individuals then we're going to then bring back to kill Osama, right? Second thing you have to note is that the kind of networks he ended up setting, the kind of successions generally meant that a lot of terrorist groups continue to thrive because of Osama bin Laden, which we think is generally problematic. So we think at the point that we kill baby Osama, we think all these things don't exist. We think we save thousands of lives, right? First thing here, why should we always value certainty versus probability? What this means is that why should we then protect people we are sure are going to be harmed, even in the case that opposition say that if we do this, harm is still going to take place regardless of whether Osama has been born? Because first, we think that if the harm has already existed and we know that a person has been generally harmed, we think that we ought to give this individual general reparations. But before I continue, POI.
For clarity's sake, are you saying that in the instance where somebody has the potential to cause harm, the immediate response should be to kill them at birth?
We're not saying if the person has potential to cause harm. We're saying we have certainty. We are here, Osama has killed people. We're going back in time, a victim of Osama, get due justice. And then that's a whole new existing timeline, and we are happy with that world. We think that's fine. That's what we're saying. So you have to prove to us why it's potential. So on our side of the house, then, we think we ought to value certainty of harm, because at the point that an individual has been harmed, this individual then requires reparations. Why can't we get reparations status quo? One, because a lot of the individuals who are generally harmed by Osama continue to live in very failed states within their different countries. Two, it's just irreparable harm. Like a lot of individuals out there have lost their children and their families who they're not going to see for many, many years. And we think that's generally problematic, right? So we think if we do this, we think it's a just much better form of reparation that doesn't exist in status quo, right? So second thing in terms of an argument, we think that if you generally do this, the thousands of lives that we save, we think is justified. In as far as we believe that thousands of children were killed by Osama, we think then that the death of one particular child, we think is much more fair in terms of utility, given the amount of utility of grief that occurred when thousands of children were killed. That's the general fear that was inspired because thousands of people were killed by Osama, something we also think is generally problematic. A lot of people not only were living with grief, but were living with general mental harm of general fear, right? For example, like in 9/11, like after that, a lot of people were generally living with different forms of insecurities within their own lives, not being able to generally risk, not being able to like go out and have fun. And we think this is a form of suffering. That's something that ultimately we think is particularly harmful. So what we do then on our side of the house is that we have a much better world without Osama in it, right? So if we don't have Osama in it, we think then this thing never happened. These people have a good life and it's amazing, right? Let's talk about then the most likelihood counterfactual and why we think this is important. Best case from opposition is that they're going to say that. Before I continue, CEO, does CEO have anything?
Yes, I do. What if, let me
No.
make this
Oh,
clarification here.
sure. Hello?
Who are you calling on? OO or CO?
Yeah, Marv was speaking, but he's gone off. Do you want to continue POI really quickly?
Right.
Sure.
Oh,
Have you ever seen Marvel's Legends of Tomorrow? I mean, DC's Legends of Tomorrow.
Yes, I've seen it. So I'm guessing that this means that if we were to kill, that generally time would come back on itself. The same kind of harm is likely to exist, right? So I think the first thing on this, we've already said, we think if a person is certain to be harmed, we think it's much better than a hypothetical person who is not yet existing is likely to be harmed. Second, we think it's just a form of reparation. We're sure Osama is going to kill these people, so we get reparations for that. In as far as we don't know who is going to get these future people, we think then in that kind of probability, we think perhaps we're more likely to get better solutions. We think in that kind of society where Osama doesn't exist, Al Qaeda doesn't become as big, just given the kind of icon that Osama was, the kind of intelligence that Osama was, we're willing to bet there's not too many Osamas. Why do we think this is true? Because generally, if you look at after, like post Osama's death, like Al Qaeda hasn't been as great as it particularly was. In as far as they had all these different succession routes, in as far as they still had the large armies and networks, they've not been able to be as successful. The crackdown was continued on this particular group, which generally means it's just very hard to get Osama, because if we had another Osama, it would be easy. So we're willing to wager that Osama is one of a kind, distraction of kind of one of a kind of a person who's likely to be one of great distraction to society. We think if we get rid of him, we think we have a much better life. So, panel, three things I've told you. One, we think that this, first of all, is likely to save thousands of children's lives, which we think, in amount of utility, it's not about killing a child and not any other thing. It's about weighing up one child's life over 1,000 children's lives. Second, it's about preparation, right? Independently of that, it's about preparation. Someone's child has been killed. We think they ought to have that kind of justice. So we take them back to we take them back in time so they can get their own reparation and closure for their own dead child. But lastly, we think Osama is one of a kind who can never be replaced. We think if we do this, we just have a much better society and world. I think we ought to value individuals who we are certain and sure are going to be harmed over hypothetical people who might not be harmed in the first place. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, PM, for that fine speech. Let's welcome the leader of opposition.
Just check if everyone can hear me.
Oh, yes, you are very audible.
Fantastic. I'll start in a second. All right. I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, the protection of time and the protection of history is a utility that we are willing to protect. We do not think that the utility of humans is something that is particularly important. We think that killing baby bin Laden is one that is extremely, extremely dangerous for time, is extremely dangerous for physics. And we think that that is something that does not necessarily bring about some sort of change. We think that that utility is arbitrary. We say that it does not exist. We think that traveling in time causes a specific rip in time that fundamentally alters time itself. We think that you are unlikely to travel in time uninterrupted. You are likely to have greater harms. You are unlikely to protect the people that you want to protect. You are likely to create greater permutations. We think that permutations for this debate, specifically, we would say, are mathematical techniques that determine possible arrangements to consequential outcomes. We don't necessarily think that that's something that comes out there. What we say is that opening government is out of the debate given the brand new context that we give you. But we're going to try and engage them in their lackluster debate anyway. We think this is Mastes, and we're willing to engage that sort of debate. But please note that this debate is fundamentally about the model, about time traveling, about the idea of killing a baby to protect the majority, and fundamentally and on a balance of probability, specifically actually hurting people and hurting humanity much more with the idea. We think that they've erred in their obligation. Principally, that sort of principle doesn't work. What do we tell you from opening government? Firstly, that utilitarian principle from opening opposition, that utilitarian principle from OG is bullshit, because we think that as a factor of reparation, you're unlikely to speak to that principle of reparation because that reason to kill doesn't exist there. Switch off your mic. We think that it needs to come from a diametrical opposition of Osama. One thing we're not going to do is we're not going to tell you that the things that he did were good, because we think that those things were heinous in themselves. We don't necessarily think that him dying in the end is something that's specifically bad, but we think that the way in which opening government wants to go about killing the baby is something that we don't necessarily speak to. Lastly, here we tell you that killing baby bin Laden is not something that is a first sort of negotiative principle. We think that that even for how he died, that was the extreme end of the spectrum, and we don't necessarily think that that's something that's good. However, bin Laden as a character stood strong within his own religious rhetoric. We think that that's something that we specifically value here. Secondly, we think that he's strongly opposed to Western ideologies and that sort of degree of exploitation. We think that that's something that's good. Given the fact that you are able to kill a baby based on a racial profiling that's incredibly arbitrary, based on things like what the baby is likely to do, that is largely speculative and not necessarily certain, think that that's absolutely bullshit, because what you do here is that you racially profile a specific individual on the speculation that they might. But even in the instance that you do have certainty that this individual is likely to commit these heinous crimes or has committed these heinous crimes, we tell you that it's much better. And given the fact that we have the technology exists, we would go back and fucking change the USA and how they necessarily operate towards these individuals. But more importantly, how just social conditions just made these people and socially conditioned these people into the people that they have become. We don't necessarily think that these individuals were ever people at that sort of instance, that they were ever people that did believe at birth that they wanted to kill. We think that social conditions such as people bombing their countries, people shitting on their religion, people not necessarily listening to brown people, we tell you those are the conditions that have necessarily indoctrinated and made this sort of opposition of this world. We tell you if we had the technology to change anything, we would fucking bomb the USA again. What we would do here, panel, if it were ever possible to bring back someone who has caused major harm to humanity, we would change the conditions which were responsible for creating those vile moments and not necessarily those individuals, because we think that if those conditions never existed, those individuals would never become those people. People become products of their circumstances, and those circumstances look like extreme poverty and exclusion and oppression. It looks like outright religious bastardization, which looks like framing a religion as one that is a terror. We think that these oppression warrants extreme sort of change, and we think that that's something that we would never ever sort of shit on. Before going, I would take Thembani because he wants to hear.
Yeah.
Interrupt.
So cool. So if Osama was a product of context and of history, why then haven't we been able to see another Osama? And doesn't that necessarily mean that there is an element of individuality that otherwise is dangerous anyway?
You're being very stupid. We're never going to see another Osama. What we're going to see is we're going to see microscopic versions of him, because there's a betterment within even how military responses work, like how intelligence work. But more importantly, we think that what's able to happen there and happen specifically for, towards those individuals is something that you don't necessarily speak to on your side, because you can't necessarily justify actually killing a baby and saying that's something that you would value based on these conditions. These conditions have even changed over time, Thembani. We don't necessarily think that that was something that's good. Firstly, here, what you principally do from us is that from their side, is that you incentivize the sort of violence perpetuated by the West, particularly on Arab people. But more importantly, you promote the idea that no child is able to change based on circumstances, and that you would rather eradicate the child and not necessarily eradicate the circumstances. We think that you further perpetuate a blame shift complex in which social issues and traumas are not blamed for the consequence of people that are created like Osama bin Laden. Incredibly understand that at the end of this debate, what we're saying is that you're not necessarily protecting these individuals. What you're doing is you're incentivizing you're Oh, can you hear me? Oh, sorry, Nolu. You're incentivizing racial profiling that's incredibly bad. Racial profile, given the characteristics of this individual and the impacts of their society, government finds it much more probable that they would commit rather than otherwise. We think that immorality of this sort of infanticide is particularly problematic at the point at which you do it to a brown child. Despite it being a despicable act in and of itself, we have absolutely no grounds on the speculation that exists on government side. We told you in the beginning that this debate happens on a spectrum. We think that if they want to create a physical a model of physics, we win this debate. But more importantly, even on the practical level, we think that you're unlikely to get some sort of change. Very proud.
Okay, thank you so much, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. Let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, very audible.
Okay, cool. So POIs, you guys know, just write them in the chat. Give me 1 second. Yeah, cool. CO, shoot at your earliest convenience. It's going to be a very fraudulent speech. Okay, so I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When I first saw this motion panel, Kagia and I just sat and had banter in prep, which is why I have nothing written on my paper, so get ready for some serious extreme sports. In engagement with OO, why exactly is killing justified, and why does the multiverse then exist, right? Cool. So first of all, why exactly is killing justified? And this is where Kagia goes and tells you, right? At the point at which there's a certain level of certainty that we know that this individual is going to commit these crimes, we know this individual is going to affect multiple generations in terms of how they grow, then we think that it is justified for us to be able to combat it at the root cause, like debaters like to say, kill it at the root cause of the problem, right? But then Webster's response to this is that, like, look, social conditions, right? They essentially think that we can change the social conditions in which Osama grew up in, and therefore change how Osama turned out. 3 reasons why that's absolute trash. 1, because the fact that Osama grew up in certain social conditions doesn't then mean that, because of these things, he decided to kill. We think that if you still decide to change the way things were, or if you keep things the way you want them to, or whatever it is that opposition wants to do, the fact that you're like trying to collapse or not collapse time in the first place just then means that you're still going to end up with different circumstances, but the same individual going through them. The only reason why we have one Osama, which Thembani tried to articulate, which is true, is because of the fact that that specific Osama perceives things in different ways. That specific Osama perceives things in a way that affects them emotionally, that doesn't necessarily do so to the rest of the people. This is why you have instances of the same people growing up in places like Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia not being killers, not being murderers, not being terrorists, but growing up amongst the same conditions. We think that this debate relies specifically within Osama. But then second of all, to the people that he actually affected, because at the point at which we go back and kill baby bin Laden, Kagia already tells you we try to, like, it's basically reparations to like save the greater good, right? We think that at the point in time when you don't do this, you have to do the comparative of the people who he actually affected and how they're better off in both worlds. We think that even if in our world their lives how somehow change because of the fabric of time, etc., all that philosophical, beautiful stuff, we still think that these people would actually have an ability to still actualize or still actually at least be alive and be able to make certain choices and have certain agencies that Osama already took away by killing these individuals in the first place. If the comparative is being alive versus being dead, no matter how your life changes in that fabric of time that we're going to change by killing him anyway, it means that you're still alive, you still have a chance at life, you still weren't killed by this actor that decided to terrorize all of you. Even if that marginally means that your life is a little bit worse in our side, you're still alive, you still have the agency to be able to change it. Our side is at least marginally better. But then secondly, why then does the multiverse exist, right? Because Webster gives this very interesting argument about like racial profiling and why that's wrong and why time collapses, right? We think that first of all, even if Osama was white American or black African or whatever Asian, we would still go ahead and kill them anyway. We don't think racial profiling is something that should hold water in this debate. One, because we're simply killing him because of his actions. Two, simply because of like the utilitarian effect that you guys decide not to engage with. We think that at the point at which you sacrifice one life for the greater good, it makes sense just because of the things like individuals do in terms of contribution to society, in terms of cultural preservation and continuation of things like tradition and identity, in terms of things like individuals being able to have some sort of agency to make changes to the world, contribute to society, and actually be able to self-actualize in certain circumstances, which you can only do when you're alive. Panel, that's the comparative. Lastly, before I go into the last thing, POI from, is this CO? Go ahead and shoot whoever it is.
Just imagine as you're speaking now on your phone and police barge into your room and say they are from the future to arrest you for murdering someone. Do you think it's the morally fair stance for them to do that?
Yeah, why not? If they know I'm gonna go ahead and kill a bunch of people anyway, like I'm gonna be dead as well. So I'm not really gonna be able to hold a grudge against them, right? So I think that, yeah, it's basically fine. Cool. So lastly, right, like why are we then being specific to Bin Laden, and what is the comparative in Upworld's best case? We think that in Upworld's best case, it's status quo. Literally everything that happens with the US, with Pakistan, with the Mujahideen is going to happen anyway. We think that they're fine with the way things happened. We think that they want to continue this fabric of time that ultimately ended up being problematic, losing a lot of military officers, losing things like state relations, losing things like basically trade deals, etc., harming the Afghan population, the US population, 9/11, and all that stuff, right? They essentially think that it's much better for that to happen, and their reasoning behind this panel is because, oh, we might cause some detriment if we alter the fabric of time because physics. Panel, recognize that if you weigh the amount of life that is lost, if you weigh how Osama not only affected lives but economies, livelihoods, future generations, the amount of like, you know, mental capacity that it takes for individuals to actually be able to contribute to things like innovation in society, then we think that even if we change the fabric of time, it's perfectly something that is justified. We think that the fact that Osama grew up in like one of the wealthiest families, right? We think that the fact that he had access to particular resources and weaponry, the fact that he like went ahead and like, you know, what is it called? Underground funding to like Mujahideen and all these individuals, the fact that he fueled Taliban, the fact that he fueled Al-Qaeda and all these things, essentially means that he was someone of particular measures of power and the ability to gather and consolidate individuals against a common enemy. This is not somebody who is just some random chokra on the side of the road who decided to steal bread. This is someone who is equivalent to Hitler. This is someone who we think that we have the ability to save multiple lives from. This is something that we then see fit. Lastly, how does it affect human personal relationships and how we essentially interact with the world? We think that at the point at which you fundamentally take away human agency, even if you harm Osama's parents, if that's something that CO wants to run, we think that that is a trade-off that we're willing to make. At the point at which they know that if, for example, they're told that they have a baby who is going to wreak havoc upon the world, we think that even if they are the parents of that baby who don't want to let go of it, we still think that it's something that is justified for them to suffer the loss of that child, for them to fundamentally like find some other spiritual means by which to connect to them their personal self, then continue to raise this child knowing that that child is going to be is going to be a negative actor in the world in the future, right? We still think that the victims that he affected in the future are some people who we need to take care of. We still think that it is necessary to change the fabric of time in order to have some sort of some sort of like stability, in the sense that people are at least still able to be alive, in the sense that people are at least still able to have some sort of agency. Lastly, the multiverse and all that beautiful stuff. I don't watch this sci-fi stuff, but you know what, I'll throw that in there just for fun. Yeah, proud to propose.
Okay, thanks so much, BPM, for that fine speech. I'm welcoming the Deputy Leader of Opposition to advance the case.
Oh, thank you. Just a second. Okay, cool. When you're ready, we can start. In 3, 2, 1. Panel, Chantal is clowning. And she's doing it because it's easy to do so from the opening government after the case that they set up as being the model for this debate. Let's deal with the model first and then go into everything else. Assume we accept that model because we've already kind of gone with it, and so the debate is happening. Let's show you in 2 ways why killing somebody from the future, based on future actions, is something that's problematic, even in the instance where you have that kind of certainty. The importance of the value of death in this discussion is twofold. One, it is something that you cannot reverse, and therefore, anything that could ultimately alter this person's life cycle within that timeline is not an option that you give them at the point where you take their lives at birth. This means 2 things. One, they don't have the opportunity to be able to become whatever it is you've already asserted that they're going to become, which means that even if you change the timeline and course of history, they become persecuted for something that they are not in any way responsible for, because at that point in time, they've done absolutely no wrong. We think in terms of just the discussions on morality and what is acceptable, this is not something that we ought be able to accept as a society. Secondly, we think that when it comes to the discussion around how you attach the value of an individual's life, we think that ultimately has become something that we begin to navigate as being based on things like actions that they actively engage in and the way in which we respond to those particular actions. At the point of infancy, this individual has not in any way interacted in any of the things that you foresee as being part of their future. Therefore, this cannot be a metric that we utilize to engage with them in the way that is ultimately going to ensure whether or not we deal with them. Then let's quickly go on and deal with the idea of Osama bin Laden specifically, and why this is problematic in terms of the way in which Osama bin Laden as an individual within society has functioned, and what that means in terms of the way in which the world has thus played itself out. 2 things in response to this. The first one they tell us is to say, Chantal says, oh, well, this is not like some random person on the side of the road who's stealing and whatever. He is Osama bin Laden. He's big. Important. The big thing and the reason why we're talking about Osama bin Laden is because he's an important figure in the history of the world that ultimately determines the way in which we interact with the world going forward. We think that the kind of lessons that come with things like having an Osama bin Laden in the world, before I go on with this, Andrews, go.
Yeah,
Andrews? Okay, when you're ready, you
yeah,
can just give me
great. So when people come into possession of information that proves a crime that's yet to happen, do you think it's justified for the perpetrators to be held accountable?
No. I think when you hear that there is a potential chance for something to happen, you can try and find ways to be able to ensure that it doesn't happen, curtail that thing from particularly happening. I think set in things like actions in motion that will ultimately ensure that this thing doesn't happen if it means that you don't harm those individuals in the process. We think that the ability to take someone's life ought not be the response that you utilize to try and ensure that you can try and curtail something. We think things like security measures, we think things like ensuring that this individual's access things like therapy if needed within their lifespan is part of the mechanisms that you utilize to try and curtail these types of actions. The reason why Webster spends a significant amount of time telling you about the profile of individuals when it comes to the way in which they interact with the world is important for two particular reasons. One is that the profile of an individual, based on the way in which they grow up, based on the way in which they interact with the world, based on the way in which the world interacts with them, determines a significant amount of their psychology and the way in which they interact with the world. This is something that's incredibly important if you note things like, one, the kind of actions that countries like the United States have undertaken when it comes to people who identify as Osama bin Laden, and even part of the groupings that Osama bin Laden has been part of. The way in which they've been able to build specific beliefs is based on these ideas, is based on the way in which they've interacted with the rest of the world. This is why it's incredibly important to understand the psychology of an individual, not this thing that we get from Chantal that basically says that because this person is a figure, we therefore need to pay attention to this. So why is history significant in this debate? And why is the history of Osama bin Laden specifically valuable in this debate? Two things. It gives us a ground map of what ultimately people engage with, and how it is that they're very likely to respond to those kinds of things in their very extreme. We think things like the creation of an Al-Qaeda, things like the bombing of buildings and various other things gives us a clear blueprint of what ultimately happens when you start to punish and push people in positions where they ultimately begin to interact with the world in a way that seeks to engage them through revenge and various other mechanisms. The importance of this is twofold. One, it says that we have a mechanism that directly engages the problems that exist within society, but also gives us a mechanism of ensuring that we deal with the causes of those very problems. When you kill Osama bin Laden, you let a United States continue with the kind of issues that they've caused in places like the Middle East without having any mechanism of engagement of response that is outside the ambit of what is considered acceptable within things like the systems that they've already created and continue to live under. Thembani, go.
So I don't think it's true that the counterfactual in this debate is like people genuinely don't pay attention to what exactly has been happening in the Middle East and what that was. I genuinely think that Osama's stance is exactly what necessitated the US to get increasingly involved in the Middle East in the first place.
No. The US is full of shit. They've been full of shit prior to Osama bin Laden. They only continue to push that shit even further when they don't have any responses coming to them. What they then do once they get responded to is to actively engage in a way that seeks to push further problems in that direction. That isn't true. I don't think that Osama bin Laden in any way truly influences things that they would have other done. What they do is simply that they get even more active in those spaces because they otherwise would have anyway, but use that kind of response as a mechanism. I don't think that any of that is particularly true. But two, I think it's incredibly important to note in this debate panel that the reason why the countries around the world have begun engaging in things like why terrorism is a problem, or have started even having discussions around things like the Taliban in the United States, is because we have these very particular kinds of blueprints that exist within the world. Because we think that on a moral basis, this is just nonsense, because we think that this is a blueprint that we practically need, and because we think it's engaging in a way that ultimately places people in a position where they aren't able to get the best out of the world, proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks so much, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. We now open the debate to the closing half. Member of Government, we are ready for you.
All right, am I audible? Please confirm.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so POIs I'll take in the chat. This is a fun round, so yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be that whole only after the fourth kind of vibe. You can shoot anytime, but exclusively in the chat. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I hadn't introduced myself. Hi guys, my name is Thembani, and wish us luck. All right. So I'll begin my speech. Wait, sorry, let me check my timer here. All right. So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think like US, truly speaking, and this is something that Nolu concedes to, has been trying to meddle in the Middle Eastern like politics for a very long time. But what we see in the example of Iran is a country that decided to take a very different action from what Osama did. What they did was to declare themselves independent and to try to remove all Western influences within their politics. what they also secondly tried to do was to also mainstream, especially through the use of media, the kind of problems that exist at a point in time where there is Western intervention, and they even interrogated with other countries who exist in the Middle East. What Osama bin Laden decides to do is to bomb the 9/11, like the World Trade Building, what is undoubtedly be dubbed as the most problematic and radical stance that has existed. In other words, when Nolu's entire stance is that we create a world in which we continue, like, to allow the US and whatever to continue their policies of like encroachment of other people's countries, we don't necessarily think it's true. What we actually think is true in this debate is that all conversations that could have been heard, especially with regards to the Middle East, and all forms of progression that we could have had, is something that ultimately died with because of like Osama bin Laden. Notice a couple of things in this debate. Firstly, it is a very comparative debate. In other words, what we needed was a fair interrogation, and what I've already showed you is why exactly we think what Op runs in this debate is extreme, right, in most instances. When they talk about the reap in time, I have like, firstly, why this isn't really like the comparative in this debate. Firstly, I think like the same argument could have been said with things such as how we build cars, and individuals complained, oh no, but you can necessarily cause these kinds of problems. The truth is tech always evolves, and with that ability to evolve, it literally means we then consider what sort of utility we get in the long term. But secondly, I think in this debate, time travel already exists. It's just a motion about whether we think it ought to be put to use in terms of killing Osama. So that is not really a comparative. But finally, I think the principle in this debate really becomes something that is very important, right? So we don't think the comparative in this debate from these guys is any meaningful, right? But I think what mostly looks like the comparative in this debate is firstly, the question of bin Laden is a question of someone who's extremely radical. And this is something that I pushed through my POI. Someone who has been extremely different. And what that particularly means in this conversation is, to what extent do we think the world would ultimately have been a much better place in instances where this guy exists, or at a point where in time where he doesn't. Other engagements are things that I'm going to integrate in my speech. Firstly, I think like when you look at this debate, what you also must consider is that at a point where like the 9/11 like existed, what existed was there was increased interference of the United States in the Middle East through things such as the removal of the Taliban, through things such as the United States like also creating their own structures in Afghanistan and all of that. The reason why that becomes extremely significant in this debate is, firstly, I think what this necessarily did, what this single point of action necessarily did, is that it worsened all the conflicts that existed in the Middle East in the first place. And then secondly, it also necessarily meant that there was an increased harms in terms of like how there was stability in discourse. Yeah, I don't have to say anything funny, right? But we think secondly, what also existed was also an assumption that everyone who is Islam and who is very radical, like is very radical in and of itself, because that is exactly the tag that Osama bin Laden carried. The fact that you are trying to like liberate Islam individuals, but at that specific point in time, you end up creating that sort of harms, right? But thirdly, and I think this is then the biggest question that we get from Nolu and Webster, the fact that this guy hasn't done the crime in the first place, it's speculative, or even if it's not speculative, he will do it in the future. Why not change him? Yeah, this is going to be good. Firstly, I think like this is something that Andrews already flagged, that at a point where someone reports a crime, we have the reason and the legitimacy in status quo to take action, despite the fact that you have not committed that crime in the first place, right? But I think secondly, at a point where Webster argues like nonsense such as reaps in time, then I think we also have like this fiat to talk about Einstein and this theory of relativity, which literally means that time in and of itself is relative. You can't say a crime will be done at a point where time isn't like that linear. It actually means then in terms of this conversation, the crime has been committed and it's a matter of taking action in retrospect. And that is something that literally stands because of the weird characterization we've gotten throughout. Sure, I will take a POI whoever has been flagging, yeah? No POIs.
Wait,
All right, great.
sure. Quick question, Thembani.
Yeah.
In the instance where somebody does, in fact, commit a crime at a later stage, what are you prosecuting them for?
Committing the crime. That is exactly like the conversation in this debate. I think, like, firstly, we already talked about how time is extremely relative, or secondly, how the idea is you are going to commit that crime anyway. And this, like, I think, like, the fear in this motion is that it has already been committed. We have the knowledge, and we are going back in the past to commit that. But I also think, like, also, we have to also interrogate the current approaches to justice and how it is something that ought to evolve, right? Especially in context of how, like this individual in this instance of this debate has already committed that crime. So for Prop to then say, like, the crime has not yet been committed, so it's not fair for us to punish him, that is not really the nuance in this debate, right? Because we think like the specific conversation is it has been. But even in instances where it's legitimate that it has not yet been done, I think also, firstly, this is where the principle in this debate starts to outweigh all the pragmatics that they talk about, right? Because what literally exists then is to say, one, you are ultimately threatening the future livelihoods of so many individuals. Number two, you are threatening the whole coexistence and stability of the Middle East. Number three, you are also threatening the whole association of Islamic religion with radicalism, which literally means so many Islams are being deprived of opportunities and they are being deprived of the ability to just become individuals, which means that unlike Zimbabweans who probably have a very hard time going to the United States, Afghanistans have an even worse time, right? Which literally means that in that context and in that conversation, that is something that we are very free to accept. I'll take a few. I firstly to see, or then if they don't shoot, you can shoot Nolu.
Okay, outside the utilitarian system or idea of saving lives, do you have another moral justification for why this is okay to do? Like beside the utilitarianism?
Oh yeah, I think firstly, like I still don't get why you're asking for moral justifications at a point where OG's entire stance was based on that, right? But secondly, I think what you already existed on our side of the house is like number one, morality in the context of this debate. And I think when you talk about morality, it's just about an idea that we think society has to be built upon. The idea that we fundamentally want to have and to exist is an idea where we fundamentally take stances to protect individuals, which literally means you can't then say utility is not morality, marvelous. That is not like how debate exists in this debate, right? So the conclusion then in this debate, wow, I'm 107. The conclusion then is to say, we think at this specific point in time, Osama was extremely radical and the harms that he causes were so great that even if it's a baby, let it die.
Okay. Thank you, the member of government, for that fine speech. Yeah, your time is done, though we couldn't get you clearly towards the end. We may now welcome the member of opposition to open the closing opposition's case.
Thank you very much. Just in case at any point in time, you can't hear me, please, I'm begging you, don't unmute yourself. Just say, and as I would, what's the problem? And then I would take you eventually. So yeah. Okay, Tembali, let me use your server since we have already great. All right, sure. So please indicate time and please. Right, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, quickly, let's deal with the utilitarianism, which is the only justification government benefits, right? First, why is it that killing bin Laden wouldn't solve the problems that occurred in history necessarily? Outside what OO tells, which we think was very relevant on how you're going to create alternative realities or blah, blah, blah. We don't think that trying to put different principles of time travel really makes sense because we think that there's a lot of different theories. There's the string theory that suggests that there's a string particle that pulls particles together that will make sure the same event occurs. There's alternative theory and many other things, right? So we can't really be sure, and I'm sure that's what Andrews would say, of what the outcomes of time travel will be for us to use it as a suggestion in such debate in itself. So we need to stick to what is pragmatic and realistic. So pragmatically, realistically, why would killing bin Laden not solve the problems that occurred is that one, the resulting social and underlying political issues were not created by bin Laden himself, right? There was an existing mujahideen activities in Saudi Arabia and the war in Afghanistan that created a rise of terrorism in itself. Bin Laden only rode on this through a necessary opportunity to be able to gain into power, right? Meaning necessarily we would have seen terrorist organization exist either ways or without the absence of Osama bin Laden himself. And why is this true? Three things. Firstly, organizations always exist in a hierarchical structure where there has to be a leader, and whoever ascends the leader becomes the controlling body and the representative of the organization in itself. Meaning, when these organizations would have formed either ways, a different version of bin Laden would have eventually existed, because the necessity to have a leader would have driven someone to be at the top of organizing these terrorist organizations either ways, whether or not Osama bin Laden was alive. What this means is we would have just had a different version of terrorism that would have occurred either way. Specifically, maybe not 9/11, but eventually the rise of terrorist organizations would have happened either ways. Why is this true? Because one, there was already US actions in Afghanistan, which was threatening the interests of majority of people within the Middle East. And it was these agitations that led, like Osama bin Laden, to roll on that populism to convince people that the West are harming our culture and we need to fight against them in itself. That meant there was a collaboration of different factions and splinter cells units that had anti-interests of the West together to form Al-Qaeda and other multiple terrorist organizations itself. It is unclear how Osama bin Laden would have eliminated in itself. If that is the case, right, it means that the utilitarian principle of saving lives and stopping terrorist organization and attacks have not easily been mitigated, because it would have happened either ways. I would have lost life eventually due to those terrorist attacks in itself. That deals with the whole utilitarianism in itself. But why is it morally unjust? And that's the principle that saves us this debate. Is that one, the actors who would do this, because don't mind this model of picking someone who was harmed by this principle, the actors who would do this collectively are the West or the Western influence actors in itself. Meaning one, the West, who were culpable to the terrible state of existence that sparked all the agitation agenda, would now be the ones using this technology to go back to the past to kill people, right? Is it right to punish people in retrospect for the actions they've committed? We say no. One, because you're principally culpable with what created those problems, there is a sort of collective responsibility that you also have a shared liability to those problems in itself, right? Meaning, going back to a point in time when none of the actors had any sort of moral liability on them, and killing one person is a selfish, principally unjust action to save yourself, because you yourself was morally culpable in itself, and you are completely escaping all the moral culpability and responsibilities. Everybody faces responsibility of their actions. So when you go into other people's territories, take their lands and oils, and run a lot of frigid political policies, the resulting outcome is that they will come to bomb your countries in itself. That principal culpability is a responsibility and the outcome of your actions that you're also responsible for. So when you do this, you deny the opportunity to face the consequences of their actions by giving them the moral high ground, because this technology is not accessible to Osama bin Laden, because he would have loved to go and kill Bill Clinton before he was born to prevent all those wars from happening. This principle shows you how there is a lack of equality and moral way up. That means the agency that is denied is principally unjust on that ground in itself. Chantelle says yes, should be happy. Why this don't weigh up is because one, Osama bin Laden is a baby and cannot consent to this. So the lack of agency principally means you're infringing on someone's stance where there's no moral equality between the both of you because you have higher ground. It is the same principle that funds things like slavery and other violent human actions, because you have more capacity than them to be able to control how life turns out in itself. We think that kind of word cannot exist because it's principally immoral in itself. The second extension I have is that they travel back to time, removing the sense of existing culpability to the targets, making you the criminal committing the cold-blooded murder. Why? If you travel back to time, at that principal point in time, Osama bin Laden has not yet done any crime, so he's as innocent as ever. But secondly, the people who you claim to have he killed have not yet died too, so there's no existing, at that point, there's no existing moral culpability to like that exist in that regard. When you kill baby Osama, the actions you blame him for wouldn't have happened, meaning there wouldn't have been any guilt, meaning that you wouldn't have had the need to travel back to time to kill him, which creates a looping paradox that doesn't settle the moral dilemma. This arbitrary problem takes us to the lottery problem, the trolley. Repeat yourself now, what's this? Takes us to the trolley problem, a moral philosophy, which is that should I let a train run its course to save 5 people or pull a switch to kill 1 person? To the extent to which the utilitarian impact of God is mitigated, we win the principal impact because one, the immorality of taking a life isn't dependent on how many lives we are taking, but on the mere idea of taking a life at all. to the extent where you've been able to principally establish that at the point you go back to time, Osama bin Laden as a baby has no moral culpability, meaning you are now the only guilty person who have committed an immoral act because you have killed a person, denying the historical consequences of actions of both parties to exist, meaning you're the only person who has blood on your hands. That means you're now a criminal in that regard, which means you're now principally unjust to exist in that system in itself. So the morality way up lies on our side of the house when you suggest two things. That one, the principally unfair balance of abilities that exist on one part makes it morally unfair to one party for you to be able to change the consequences of their actions. Two, the generally shared culpability of both actors makes it inconsequential to blame the other actor for the occurrence of those actions in itself. The last way up is that the going back to the past creates a looping moral dilemma that settles on opposition side, because at the point where you take a life and you're the only person who is now principally culpable, you are wrong, because the morality of taking a life isn't dependent on how many persons, but dependent on the fact that you're taking a life at the first instance, or you're taking a life at all. That means whoever goes back to the time to kill baby Osama bin Laden will be committing murder, and there will be no other justification for this in itself. The lack of principle justification shows us why we win, because we mitigate the idea of utilitarianism of solving solutions in itself. We probably win this debate.
Okay, thank you so much, member of opposition, for that fine speech. We now welcome the government whip to conclude the government case.
Hello, guys. Am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Awesome. So I'll take POIs in the chat, and yeah, most likely one from OO. So I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. You see, I thought OO would probably be fourth until Marvelous's speech, and this is why. He gave no exact extension, and every single thing he said is a rehash. He just branded it with different words, and I'll just deal with him. Just hold on. But let's move on to opening opposition. Opening opposition says they want to protect history, right, and time, but that is weighed up against the pain of the casualties and the harm on religion and the abrogation of the identity of thousands and millions of Islam that's going to occur when you allow Osama bin Laden to happen, which means the comparative is not protection of history versus nothing. It's protection of history versus the catastrophe that you allow to happen in order to unfold that history. We say from closing government, if the mere value of history is going to override the amount of pain that Osama bin Laden will cause, we think is irrational to allow him to exist. So, and this is why it's funny, because they argue the protection of history and come back to say, Osama hasn't or won't commit the crime, right? Won't commit the crime because they can change things. If you can change things, then you are equally distorting the history you so wish to protect. We really think it's inconsistent on their side, and it's unfair to this debate. Second thing they talk about is proactive mechanism, which Nolu describes. Oh, let's put in security measures. For God's sake, which kind of security measure has been able to deal with unpredictable terrorist attacks? Like, for all you know, no matter the amount of security systems you put in place, terrorism is radical, and they equally keep up with updated technological advancements to beat updated security systems. So we really don't see a clear metric of dealing with that. Secondly, she says therapy. The mere reason why Osama is who he is because he is one of a kind. It's like Hitler saying that therapy would cure people like that, which when therapy has failed to cure even people with low lower mental illness, is flawed. We really think that the kind of twitch to his mind is one that therapy wouldn't have been able to deal with, right? Then the third thing they say, Osama defended his religion. The most ridiculous thing I've heard in this debate. Osama's actions justified the most large-scale assault on the Islam religion and its identity. It made the whole world look and equate Islamism with radicalism, and literally denied massive amounts of Muslims the jobs, the livelihood that they deserve, simply because of the one act that Osama did. You cannot be the one that defends that Osama protected his religion. Thirdly, they say the actions are justified and as a result of self-defense, because the West was already distorting that place. And that's the same thing Marvelous runs on. And here's the point: self-defense is only justified if it doesn't worsen the harm, right? But secondly, it's also only justified if it doesn't take away culpability on the perpetrator. What Osama's action did was to justify every single action that the West had been doing and continued to do in the Middle East. And that's why no institution, not even the UN, has been able to call the US to order after Osama's actions. Why? Because he justified them. Secondly, he worsened the harms that they were facing, because now the US said, no, we are not sending 2 battalions. We are sending a large-scale war for more than a decade. You can't defend that as self-defense on that regard, right? Whoa. Guys, hold on. Yes, which timer is this one? Because I'm not sure I've even to 3 minutes yet, and it's 6 minutes already. No, I want to know how many minutes I have so I can know when to take POIs. Guys, how many minutes have I? Because I know I'm not. Yeah, I'll take a POI before I resume my speech. I just need to know the time, because it's funny how I'm on 6 minutes already. Okay, can we pause all the times and then give me 5, like
4 minutes left?
Yeah, I've got 4 minutes left. Okay, sure. Webster, I'll take your POI before I move on.
Okay, Andrews, besides all the bullshit the opening government and the closing government are running, please tell us why we should not take off your mask and reveal that it's Hillary Clinton.
You see, the problem is that your POI is as bullshit as whatever equation you want me to give you. So I don't see how much you want me to respond to it. But here's the actual response to your case. Because aside everything I've responded to, the only other thing you argued is that there can't be another Osama. 2 responses: if there can't be another Osama, you can't be the team that argues the abrogation of history. But secondly, we say that there can't be another Osama because the context which you argue, there is context, and that context would have produced microaggressions of Osama, micro bits of Osama, right? We equally argue that, first of all, you have no certainty of fiat to determine that. But secondly, the mere fact that that context exists, and we've not seen another Osama, tells you that the evidence in itself defeats you. Let's look at closing opposition. Closing opposition says, terrorism wasn't created by Bin Laden, and so he's just a victim of Bin Laden. The bullshit context argument that Webster gives you. Here's the response. That's the scenario in all crimes. Poverty for most criminals in Africa wasn't created by the criminals, but they are still punished for it regardless. We don't think context is a justification. Why? Because human morals say, even within terrible context, the test of your morality is to be able to be morally upright. When you distort from that moral uprightness, is justified to punish you, right? Secondly, they say there already has been an invasion in Afghanistan. We agree, but what we say is that what Obama did justified the much more large-scale invasion and eroded any discussion on the previous invasion to hold America accountable, and that's why their world is far more terrible. The third responsible for some of the causative elements. If the West kills Obama, is bad. The government is responsible for almost every single causative element that causes people to steal. The same government has the arm of justice. The West are part of global organizations such as the UN, right? Who ensure that they are the ones that are able to deal with catastrophes when they happen around the world. They have a moral obligation to stop them. The same way, even though the state is complicit, they have that responsibility, is justified, right? But then finally says the immorality of taking a life has nothing to do with the numbers. Utter bullshit, because the judiciary system in itself disagrees. That's why when you take one life, it's murder, and they sentence you to life by a terrorist
would rather take the death sentence because we think that there's an extreme version of abrogation of morality. You can't defend all of them in the same way, right? But the final thing we say from closing governments is that, see, the biggest thing Osama wanted to do, which is what OO argues, is that he wanted to protect the Islam identity and make it a more acceptable identity. What we argue from CG, is that he didn't. He worsened matters, even his own agenda, he failed at it. It is justified to erode his kind, erode his lineage, bury him, even if it's burying him alive. Because what he did worsened the millions of Islams and their lives far more than he could ever imagine. His quest for heroism and his test to satisfy his radicalist bullshit made him a far more worst entity for the Islamist identity, far more than you can imagine. And this is true because today there is a reason why when you hear radicalism. Why? Because Osama gave the West the justification to do so. In this debate, there is nothing good that Osama has done for us to protect him, even when we know what he's going to do, because the access to information comes with a moral justification to take him out. Proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Government Whip, for that fine speech. We are going to welcome the opposition whip to conclude the opposition case and also to conclude the debate.
Okay, I cannot be heard.
Yes, you're very audible.
Great, thank you. Just give me a few seconds to turn on my light. Yes. Debating at 3 a.m. That's me. Okay. For pure eyes, just put on the chat space. I don't think I'll take anyone, given that you guys have been messy. But if I do, just put on chat space. I'll let you know that I'm checking you. Yeah. Okay. I will be. Okay. Welcome to the coaching session. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. The moral dilemma that we're faced with in today's debate is just in two folds. That is to say, do we alter the history of individuals by eliminating the actors that would have been involved in those actions? For example, do we imprison Zuma before he steals the government money? Do we kill Thanos? Does killing Thanos before uses like Infinite Stones save the Avengers? Do we kill people like Cecil John Rhodes before the scramble and partition of Africa? Do we kill Mace and Ping Pong before they win this debate? Panel, the principle in this debate that closing opposition is defended is not been engaged within like the debate. You're going to get then 3 things. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, whether it works. And lastly, the outcomes. This is something that is very important. What then do we get from closing government in particular? Firstly, they say Bin Laden was extremely radical. We don't deny that he was extremely radical. What's important here is for you to analyze and prove why that kind of radicalism is a bad thing. From closing opposition, we say that kind of radicalism was usually important for a couple of reasons. Why? Because Bin Laden was fighting for the liberation of the Muslim groups. That is to say, there was a huge support of the Russian atrocities against the Muslim. The support of the Western ideologies against like Iraq. The presence of the US troops in Saudi Arabia. When Bin Laden came into power with his radical ideas, he was fighting against like those kinds of narratives and norms that existed within like Western ideologies. Note here, we say from closing opposition that kind of radicalism was serving the image of the Muslim groups at that point. The second thing then that I give you in terms of extension is like, oh, Osama bin Laden destroyed his people by taking all the jobs and all those kind of things. I didn't get that kind of analysis really. The third thing that they do provide is like bin Laden was threatening the livelihoods of many people. They don't give you an analysis of like why that is true. I already told you that because their claim here is like bin Laden was threatening the existence of the Islamic groups that further harms Panel, from closing opposition, Ping Pong gave you a clear-cut extension to say Western ideologies already existed. It means they were already infiltrated before the existence of bin Laden, i.e. things like the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq at that point. That is to say, the harms of the Islamic groups were going to be existence anyways. Ping Pong told you that in a world where you kill bin Laden, they don't prove from the government team that you were going to stop other people from like attaining the position of power in ISIS or from like forming other like harmful extremist Islamic groups that are going to fight against these kinds of individuals. I want you to note here, the moment then we say these people have been affected, it means they were going to mobilize and come together. Ping Pong told you that in our extension, that organizations already existed anyways, and organizations operate in a hierarchical structure that allow you to have a leader at that point. Bin Laden was very lucky to be the leader. If you kill him, the organization will still exist. We can still have Ping Pong being the leader of that kind of group. Ping Pong can still have the same power to bomb the Twin Towers in America. What the government teams need to do then is to try and analyze and prove that that kind of idea was less likely to occur at that point. This is something that they failed to engage with from closing government at that point. Secondly, this being a policy debate, there was very need to engage on the identity of the actor. The government teams, throughout the whole debate, they don't engage the principle. They just argue on utility to say, we want to save more lives. We want to defend more people. We already told you that there is no fiat that you are more likely to defend those kinds of lives. From closing opposition, we say there is a principle here, the principle that underpins the actor. We say the actor oftentimes has got a Western influence. Note, it's an actor motion. This house will do something. It means there's someone who has to do it. Government teams then, we say, from closing opposition, then we say there is someone who is going to have the kind of action. That is to say, that person has got like Western influence. Then we say that becomes morally unjustified in terms of principle. Why? We say oftentimes these individuals were culpable of the terrible state of existence that sparked the rise of war on terror and the bombing of Twin Towers. At that point then, when we prove to you that they were culpable, it means they don't have any moral legitimacy to kill bin Laden at that point, given that themselves, they were the ones that sparked the war in Afghanistan. They were the ones that led to the rise of bin Laden. It's untrue from closing government to claim that like the reason why there was like infiltration of the West within Afghanistan, it was just because of bin Laden. Panel, an analogy to this is the Britain went to Africa and did any forms of colonialism. That's how the Western ideologies and narratives are. They are usually infiltrating in nature. They're pervasive. They try to be so dominant in power. We say, even if without bin Laden at that point, we're still going to have like those kind of them being like so influential at that point. This is something then that we proved from closing opposition that we're less likely to have. Now then, to the team that was like less important in the debate, opening government. Opening government gives you a couple of ideas. The first thing that I do talk about is the idea of reparations. So I think like reparations may be important to some degree, but I think like there is a need for people to understand what are reparations, because you can't just like say, because I think like when people think about motions about extremism and ideologies, the first thing that comes to mind, reparations, let's run reparations. No, you can't just do that. You need to understand what reparations are and how they look like. What do people care more about, right? So even if it's true that like, let's just put an analogy, right? Assuming that my child is killed like in the process made by bin Laden, right? And then you say, let's push back the time and kill bin Laden, and then you say MACE is going to have reparations. No, that's untrue. You don't get reparations by killing someone else at that point. People don't really care about you killing back an individual. I think there was a huge need for opening government to provide a strong analysis on why people should care more or like should have like huge reparations at that point. The other thing that opening government runs in this debate that was not hugely important. So I'm trying to look for the paper because opening government was useless, so I just threw everything away. Okay, the first thing that they ran was like, why should we target Osama? under this, they try to squirrel and say, opposition teams have a huge burden to defend the status quo. That is to say, things that are happening in Afghanistan are going to happen anyways. Sure, that is true. They're going to happen. But you don't prove why that can't happen in your world, given that Ping Pong asked you a pure eye that you didn't even respond to, right? That pure eye was usually trying to prove to you that there is a moral principle in this debate to say you can't just assume that just because you have killed bin Laden, you have solved all the harms. For example, killing Nolu today doesn't stop World 22 from happening. We can just like find another DCA who can just go there and replace Nolu. That is the hierarchy structure that exists when it comes to organization and when it comes to like how things do operate at that point. The principal understanding, therefore, at the end of this argument is that killing individuals based on the atrocities that their organizations have committed does not solve the problem, right? You don't really kill the leader and say you have managed to solve. An example here is like people assume that when Mugabe was going to die, Zimbabwe was going to be a better place. Mugabe died 3 years ago. Zimbabwe is so worse at that point. This is something that you need to understand, right? The third thing that opening government runs was like, oh, we don't argue on the certainty of harm because the harm is occurred. Oh, is time up? Okay, let me just conclude. In conclusion, then, I think closing opposition become the better team because we show you the principle in this debate, a principle that is important to understand that individuals operate under an organization that is got a form of hierarchy at that point. Yes, we oppose.
Here. Serious organizing that speech.
Okay, thank you so much, Opposition Whip, for that fine speech. Thank you so much. The debater has participated in a master's round. It was nice, it was fun, it was interesting. So I'm going to be sharing the link of opinion polls for all of you who listened in. You can just share in your opinion what team you think was the best for you or should win this round, and maybe what speakers you consider to have been the best speakers. Yeah, so I'm going to be sharing the link in a few. Just give me some few minutes. Yeah, so we start deliberations. Yeah, thank you so much again. Thanks so much to our speakers. It was nice having you. Yeah, it was fun.